Hey, what's up everyone? Today I'm going to do my best to try to explain how this works in JavaScript, the this keyword, how this is bound when you're executing functions. So in most cases, this is bound based on how the function is called. So there's 4 different ways. I like to categorize it in 4 different ways: function style, call and apply style, constructor style, or method style. Now, there's some other differences between classes versus using like a prototypes, and there's differences between defining the function with the function keyword versus using an arrow function. There's also differences for strict mode. And so we'll go over kind of each of these in detail and try to explain the best I can what the difference is between each of these. So with function style, and by function style, I mean when you're calling a function this way, so we call fn. So if fn is the name of the function, I'll just like create an empty function here at the top. We'll call it function fn. And then maybe we have like a, b, c. It'll take in 3 arguments here. And if we were to call like what's this, so we're going to talk about what this keyword is bound to. So for function style, here we're using the fn, the name fn, and the name fn here, fn refers to the name of the function. So the name of this function is fn, the name of this function is fn. Now we use 2 parentheses, an open parentheses and a closed parentheses, to invoke the function. If we were to just write fn like this, and that was our entire line, then that would just be referring to the function. That would not actually call the function. So we need to invoke the function with parentheses. So when a function is called function style, this is bound to the global object. So by default, this is bound to the global object. Now, when you're in Node, that global object is going to either be some global object, or if you're at the very top level, that's like the module exports thing. So, but by default, just know that when you call something function style, when you call a function function style, then this is bound to the global object. Now here's a couple other examples. We might pass in 1, 2, 3 as our arguments to the function. So that is function style, and that is how this is bound. All right, let's talk about call and apply style. It turns out that when you define a function, as we have here at the top, that is creating an instance of a function object. So it's creating an instance of a class, and the class is a function. And the class function has a couple of methods. 2 of them are call and apply. So if we wanted to, another way that we could invoke this function or call this function is using the call or apply method. So we could say fn.call here. So fn, notice that we're saying fn, but we're not invoking fn. We don't have parentheses right after fn. Instead, we're using a method, so we're calling the call method on the function object. And what we can do now is the first argument to call is some object, maybe we say like, const, this is my this, and that can refer to any object. And if we pass that in as the first argument to call, this is my this, then when fn is executed, the this keyword inside of fn, when it executes, will be bound to whatever we pass in as the first argument to call. Same thing with apply. So call and apply work the same way in that there are 2 options for invoking a function, and call and apply here are called, and the first argument is the object we want to bind to this explicitly, and then in the case of call, it can accept numerous other arguments. You can just like pass in 1, 2, 3. That would be this line would be the equivalent to this line up here, where we're executing the function, we're explicitly binding this, and then we're passing in the arguments 1, 2, 3. So here we're invoking the function and we're passing in 1, 2, 3. This way, or like when we call the function style here, this is bound to the global scope. When we call the function call style down here, this will be bound to the object, this is my this. All right. The difference between call and apply is that call takes the arguments kind of separated out, 1, 2, 3, and apply accepts the arguments 1, 2, 3, but these ones are inside of an array. And the way that I can, the way that I remember which one is which is that apply starts with an A, array starts with an A, and so you can just remember that apply accepts its arguments in an array, in a second argument to apply. So apply takes 2 arguments. The first is what you want to bind to this. The second argument is an array of arguments that should be passed to our function so that when we invoke the function this way, this is bound and these arguments are passed. So these two are also equivalent. All right, so that's call style. That's like one way that you can explicitly set or bind this. We'll talk about bind in a little bit. All right, so the third way I want to talk about is constructor style. So if we call the function like so, right, we know this is function style. But if we were to prepend this with the new keyword, then the resulting object is or the resulting this that's bound when this function is called will be a new instance of an object. It's like a brand new object that you can create, and generally you're constructing an instance of something. So constructor style is when we use the new keyword at the beginning. So we'll talk about how that works. And then finally we have method style. So method style looks like this. We might have dog.bark. Okay, where bark is a method on the dog class and dog is an instance of the dog class. So here, the way this works is that we have an object dog and then we have the dot operator, and the dot operator is how we can look up properties. That's how we can do property accessing. So when we say dog.bark, this expression here, dog.bark, is going to look up the bark function or look up the bark property on the dog object. And then by using the parentheses here, we are invoking bark. And when we invoke bark, when we invoke a function that was just looked up on an object, then this, when this function is called, this will be bound to the object that's on the left-hand side. That's by default. Now, there's ways that you can explicitly change what this is bound to. However, when you call the function this way, this is called method style. Notice that fn.call and fn.apply are methods on the function object. So the function itself is an instance of an object where you can execute a method or a function called call, method style, and in this case you're calling the method, and this by default inside of the call function when the call executes is the function, but then when it's actually run, this is bound. There's no way to implement call or apply with just writing JavaScript. These are parts of the language that are built in when you are running JavaScript. So here's the 3 different ways. We've got function style, call apply style, constructor style, and method style. So these are all sort of the default ways. And I wanted to go through some examples for all of these. So I'm going to start down here and we'll talk about function style first. So if we have that function fn, and let's say it takes a, b, c, and let's console.log this, and we'll console.log, and then we'll also just like say console.log a, b, and c. So a, b, and c are the arguments, and then this is going to be the keyword that's bound when we execute the function. So if we're going to call the function style here, then by default this inside of here is going to be the global object. So let's run this, node this.js. So I'm just running a script locally here, and that's what we get. So this, in this case, like this big, huge object that we're seeing printed out is the global object that's inside of Node. Okay, so this is some global object. If we were to run this same code inside of the browser, okay, so we're going to paste this code, this will be bound to the window. So when we're working in the context of a browser, which is a lot of folks start out and they're writing code that's on the front end, it's in JavaScript, it's written on the front end in the browser, then this, the global object on the browser, is the window. So here, when we execute this function, this is bound to the window. Now, note that we get undefined, undefined, undefined. That's because we didn't pass any arguments to fn. If we passed 1, 2, and I don't know, test, then we should see those printed out at the bottom also. So now we're seeing 1, 2, and test printed out. So this, again, this stuff is how we execute a function style. So we'll just put that here. All right, now let's do the same thing, but call and apply style. So we're going to use our same function. Actually, I'll just leave it there. Yeah, well, let's call it fn2. So we'll say fn2. Okay. But instead of invoking it directly here, function style, let's use call or apply style. So we're going to say .call, and now we need to pass in some object that is the first object here. So let's create a new object. We'll just call it like const person, and here maybe they have like a name, and that's yeah, CJ. All right, cool, whatever. So now we're going to use the call style where we pass in person as what we want to explicitly bind to this. So in this case, this in here should be bound to person. So we should see this object printed out rather than this huge global object printed out, because now we're going to call it call style, and we're going to explicitly pass in this. All right, so let's run it again. Okay, cool. And I think you can see that. Let's see. Oh gosh. All right, so at the end of our function that was executed, oh, let's comment out this invocation. Okay. All right, so what we get back is this was this object, right? Because person is what we're bound to. And then we also have 1, 2, and test. So if we had, maybe if we had the age, and we'll just say 21, and then we'll say console.log this.age plus a plus b, right? So now we're going to take in 2 arguments, 1 and 2, and then we're going to add those to the person object, so we should get 24. All right, so we printed out 24, and here we're accessing the age property on the person object that we explicitly passed in. That's why we can call this.age. Now, if we were to try to call fn2 explicitly, just like 1, 2, test, right? This is going to fail because age is undefined, right? So, or we get nan, which is fun. Okay, so same thing. If we execute fn2 with apply, we can pass in person, and then the only difference is that we want to pass these arguments as an array. All right, so let's run this again. Again, we get 24. Again, we get our object that's correctly bound. So that is call and apply style. This might be useful if you're writing a function that is taking in some list of arguments, and then or it's taking in a function and a list of arguments, and you want to execute that sometime later. But it's a little bit less common than just calling the function as you see. All right, so I'm going to comment those out so we don't execute fn2. Let's go talk about constructor style. All right, so I'm actually going to just comment all of these out. Okay. So for constructor style, this is when we're constructing a new instance of an object. So let's say we have a class, or we want to define a class like an old school ES5 class like this, where we say function cat, and the cat is going to have a name. So we're defining a new function that takes in a name as a variable. Notice that I used a capital C here. That's not it's not required. JavaScript doesn't care if you name it with a capital C or a lowercase c. But generally, when you're creating a function that is a constructor function, one of the ways that you can signal that it's a constructor function is by capitalizing the name of it. So here, if we were to just like console, or let's say console.log name. No, let's say this.name equals name. All right, so in this case, right, when we call it constructor style, so if we say, if we were to just say cat name, all right, so let's make it console. I'm gonna add some methods to the cat. So we're gonna say cat.prototype.meow is equal to a function. And here in the function, we'll console.log this.name. We'll just start with this.name, and then we'll work up from there. So if we say const cat equals new cat, and we'll pass in the name Garfield or something. And then if we say cat.meow, right, and we execute it, and we run this code, we should get back Garfield, and we see Garfield, right? So what this is, okay, so we wrote out a lot of stuff, right? So here, is the actual invocation. We're calling new Garfield, or we're using the new keyword and passing in Garfield. If we were to not use the new keyword, then cat, this function, is not actually returning any, there's no like return value from cat, right? So cat is going to be returning undefined by default. So if we run this again, we're going to see an error that says cannot read property meow of undefined. That's because our cat function doesn't actually return anything by default. Okay, remember that. Now, so when we call it function style, the return value is whatever the return value from cat is. And in this case, we didn't return anything. If we were to return this, then this should work. So if we were, no, I'm sorry. It's not going to work because this is still not created as an instance of a cat. So in order to make this work, right, we need to use the new keyword. And by using the new keyword, there is a default return value from the cat constructor function. And that is going to be the instance, the new instance of the cat. So that is going to return the brand new this. So if we execute this again, right, then we see Garfield. That's because we're able to look up meow on the cat object and find Garfield. So what is this prototype thing that's going on here, right? So when we're creating classes, so in JavaScript, it uses prototypical inheritance. So you can build up the prototype chain to define or to like work with inheritance in JavaScript. This is how you used to define classes before the class keyword became available in JavaScript, is you would have to add properties to this prototype object. Okay, so in this case, what happens is we're creating a new instance of a cat. We get back a new instance of a cat, and then when we do the property lookup, if we say cat.meow, that looks on the cat object itself and says, does the cat object itself have a meow property? And it does not have a meow property. So then it says, okay, if it doesn't have a meow property, so is there a cat.meow? No. Then it says like, okay, is there a cat.__proto__.meow? Yes. So when we create this instance using this constructor style, it is setting this secret and private __proto value on the cat object that when we go to do property access on the cat, it's going to look up and it will follow through those protos all the way up until it encounters a meow, or until it encounters the name of this property. So in this case, meow happens to be on the class that cat is an instance of. However, you could have like multiple chains of inheritance. So you could have maybe meow was defined on the animal object and cat inherited from animal. We're not going to go over inheritance right now, but this is kind of what's happening is we're looking up and trying to find meow, and we happen to find it on this prototype. And so cat.meow, just cat.meow is a function, and we're able to invoke that function method style here. So we're invoking the function method style. And so when we invoke method style, on the left-hand side, we have the object that is bound to this when meow is executed. So constructor style is really just this bit here. That is creating the new instance of the cat and creating the new instance of this that is bound inside of our cat function. So this is constructor style. So I'm going to put this here, and we'll put these two comments above that. And then let's go talk about method style. I'm going to move this down here a little bit. So we'll just put it down here. All right. So again, if we have our new instance of a cat, right? The new instance of the cat here is going to be, we'll just say cat2. And then when we say cat2.meow, let's actually console.log this function. We're not going to actually execute cat2.meow in this case because we didn't put parentheses at the end. We're just going to console.log what meow is. All right. So meow itself is an instance of a function. So this is like JavaScript's kind of like console log for the toString of a function object, where it prints out the square brackets and then the function. So because we were not actually executing meow, we're not printing out like the return value or anything of meow. We're actually just returning the function. And you'll notice here when we're console logging it, we just see function and really no other details. That's because meow is defined as an anonymous function. So this function here, we said function and then the open close paren and then like the curly braces, right, to define the function body. Whereas if we look up higher, our other functions that we've been working with have names. So here we said function and then we had a space and then we had the name of the function and then parentheses. So that named the function. Here, same thing, right? Function, and then we had a space, and then we had cat, which was the name of the function. In this case, we're saying function and then parentheses, and there's no name for the function, but that we can change that. We can say meow. We can give it a name if we want. And now when we console.log the function, we see the name of the function also. So by default, a very common like pattern is to use this cat.prototype.meow, right? Another way that you might see this manifest is, so let's just go through this. So like if we were to execute cat2.meow, right? Then inside of the meow function, when we execute meow, this will be bound to the instance of the cat that's on the left-hand side. So if we say console.log this, we should see the instance of the cat. And we see an instance of a cat and its name is Garfield. Let's comment this out. Garfield v2, and sorry, we need the cat constructor still. Okay, so for cat, we see an instance of a cat and its name is Garfield v2. Now, this same method style, you'll see it in other ways, right? So like you don't necessarily need to use the constructor in order to create an instance of an object that has a meow or has a property that is a method, right? So here's another way we could do this. We could say like const person is equal to an object. We can just say it's a JSON object and their name, maybe their name is Jenny Rosen, and they have a say hi method, and that is a function that when they say hi, they say console.log, hi, my name is, and then this.name, so it's going to be their name. All right, so then if we say person.sayHi, we're executing sayHi method style, right? And when we execute sayHi method style, this will be bound to the person object. So let's also console.log this. All right, so the first thing we're printing out is the object. So this is the object, and we see the name, and the name is Jenny Rosen, and we also see say hi, and that is a function here. And in this case, say hi actually has a name also. So when we're defining functions directly like this, the function will be named for you by JavaScript. And here we say hi, my name is, or we see hi, my name is this.name, or Jenny Rosen, right? So it's able to access that property. Now, here's where things get kind of interesting, right? Because you could have an instance of a cat, right? So we're going to construct an instance of a cat. And what we could do is we could say, I'm going to look up the say hi function on person, but I'm not going to invoke it the default way. Instead, what I want to do is call say hi, but I'm going to use the call apply way. And I'm going to say hi, but as a cat. So we can say person.sayhi.call, and we can pass in cat2. In this case, right, we're looking up the function on the person object. That's going to give us back this say hi function. It's going to give us back this function. And because we're using the .call method on the say hi function, we're able to explicitly bind this cat object, which also has a name, it has Garfield v2, to this, or we're explicitly binding this to the cat2 object. So if we run this, we should see, hi, my name is Garfield v2. And you see that when we console.log this, we're seeing the name is Garfield v2. So we're explicitly binding this to cat2 by executing say hi call style here. So this is just like another way of sort of changing what this is bound to. So I'm going to go back to this back to method style here, like so. All right, so that's all fun. That's kind of cool stuff. All right, let's go a little bit further and talk about classes versus prototype. So we talked about prototype before. There's another way to define instances of classes, and that's using the class keyword. So we can say class dog, and if we want to initialize the dog, instances of the dog with some data, we're going to use a constructor. A constructor function, which might also take in the name. And inside of the constructor function, we have reference to the this keyword. And when we're defining a class, it's a little bit more clear that this constructor is like an initializer, or is like an underscore underscore init underscore underscore in Python, or like a def initialize in Ruby, or this is a really common pattern in other languages where you have a class and that has some constructor function, and that's how you create instances of that class. So here we can say this.name equals name. And then let's, okay, so we'll say const d equals new dog. And we can pass in the name Stanley here. And let's just, we'll just console.log d. And then we'll see an instance of a new dog. All right, so we see a new dog, and its name is Stanley, and it's bound to the new instance of the object. So d.name is going to be Stanley. So we can just say like d.name, and that prints out Stanley. Okay, so it's very similar to the prototype style, but it's so much cleaner. So if we wanted to add a method, we can just say bark, and then we can console.log maybe this.name says bark. Okay, so if we wanted to, we could call bark method style. So we're going to say d.bark and execute it. So we're using the parentheses. We're looking it up on D. That means that this will be bound to the instance of the dog inside of the bark function. So if we execute this again, Stanley says bark. Okay, so that's super cool. Again, we could create, you could create an instance of another dog, like dog2, and maybe that dog's name is Max. And similarly, we could mess around and say like dog.bar or d.bark dot apply, right? And then pass in d2, and that would execute the bark function, but bound to the other dog. So if we run this, we see Max says bark. Even though we didn't explicitly call d2.bark, we're still seeing Max because we're executing the bark function here, and we explicitly bound this to d2. All right. So that's another way that you can do this. So I'm going to say d.bark. I'm going to put this back to just invoking it method style. The other thing that's kind of interesting is if you console.log d.bark, in the case of a class, then it'll use this name. So you don't have to use the function keyword anywhere. It's just going to create it's just going to create the bark function for you and name it for you. So that's kind of handy and a nice convenience. And to be honest, in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot less use of the prototype style and prototypical inheritance in general in JavaScript, because folks just prefer the class syntax, and it's just a little bit cleaner if you're writing object-oriented JavaScript, that is. Okay, so that is what I wanted to talk about, I think, for class versus prototype. There's also there's like a bunch of interesting like little caveats, like if your subclasses don't return an object, then there might be some failure, but you can check out MDN for some edge cases. I really want to just go through like the most common use cases, which again, function style, call apply style, constructor style, and method style. All right, so let's talk about function versus this new arrow function thing that was released in ES 2015. So if we have a function fn, right? And we say console.log this, and we invoke fn, then this again will be bound to the global object. So if we run this, we should see the global object is this big messy blob in Node. That's totally cool. But if we separately created another function, const fn2, and we're going to set that equal to a new arrow function that just returns this. Then if we execute fn2, this will be bound to the enclosing scope. So in Node, by default, when you're like working at the very top level, so out here, so if this is, x equals 1 or something, when you're working at the very top level scope in Node, this is bound to module.exports. So in this case, we're going to see a little bit of a difference between this when we're talking about fn versus this when we're talking about fn2. So console.log this. All right, so if we run this, you see that we get back an empty object. That's because in the arrow case, arrow functions don't bind to this. They don't have they don't change what this is in their context. So when we're in the body of an arrow function, this is whatever this was when we were just outside the body of the arrow function. So this does not have a way to, arrow functions don't have a way to bind this. Okay, so even if we were to call or explicitly try to pass in some this to fn2, right? So like with fn, with a full function that we've defined this way, we can bind this to whatever we want. So we say const bind, or like this is a new object that has like x is pointing to 1. All right, so if we said fn dot call this is my this, right? Then when we execute the function, then fn1 is binding this explicitly. But if we try to do the same thing with fn2, it won't allow us to change anything. It doesn't actually bind anything, right? So we're still getting back that empty object. Okay, so we're still getting back this empty object that points to this module.exports thing, because arrow functions, when a function is defined like this, or when a function is defined this way, this is, again, it's bound to the scope that's enclosing the function. In this case, the scope that encloses the function is the module.export, so this top level thing inside of Node. So when we're talking about arrow functions, one thing to be careful of is they don't behave the same way as functions defined with the function keyword. So if you're writing that same kind of like person object that we had here, right? And you have this say hi function, but if you define it as an arrow function instead, then person.sayHi is not going to work as you expect. So if we were to, let's clean these up. If you were to run this like this, hi, my name is undefined, because this .name is not defined the module.exports object, which is bound to the this keyword inside of the arrow function here, does not have a name property. And so when we call person.sayHi here, because it's an arrow function, this is not bound to anything. So we need to use the function keyword if we want this bound to the object that we're talking about when we're calling it method style. So the arrow style functions don't have binding to this. There's a couple other things they don't bind to that are nice to haves for normal functions, like the arguments keyword and a couple other things. So just something to keep in mind when you're using those functions. All right, now when we're talking about strict mode, when you have a function that's defined like so, if you return this in strict mode, when strict mode was added, if you were not explicitly binding this to anything and you were calling it function style like so, right? There was something in the spec that said if you use strict mode, then this should be undefined inside of the function. If you're calling a function style, this should be undefined. But there was a mistake when browsers implemented, strict mode, they didn't follow this pattern. And so they kept returning the window or the global scope even when this was I'm sorry, even when the function was called function style, they would continue to return and give access to the window, even in strict mode. So that is one of the differences. So if we go to run this, oh yeah, let's see, console.log. Let's console.log the result of calling that function, and we'll see that it is the global scope. Again, in practice, that should have been undefined, but browsers didn't follow that pattern. So you might get a little bit of a difference between strict mode and not strict mode when you're working with this and executing the function style. Okay, the one final thing that I wanted to cover is the bind keyword, because like call and apply, there's another method that's available on the function object that is called bind. And bind allows you, again, to explicitly bind this. The difference between call and apply and bind is that bind does not execute the function. So if we have fn, we can say fn.bind, and then we can pass in some this. So if we say const myBound this is a new object where, A points at B. Okay, so if we say .bind myBound this is not actually going to execute the function, right? We're getting back nothing. When we run our code, nothing happens. Nothing prints out because fn.bind does not actually execute our function. Instead, it returns a new function that can be called. So here we might say like const fn2 equals fn.bind. Then we can say fn2 and we can execute it any of the ways we talked about before. Method style, function style or call apply style or whatever, right? Like most commonly you're going to execute something that was recently bound by function style. But now, because we're calling it function style, we are changing what the default was. By using bind, we are changing what the default behavior is. Because before, when we called something function style, remember that this was bound to whatever the global object was, but because we're explicitly binding here, then when we execute fn2, it's going to use the this that we passed in. So if we say node this, let's see, what do we want this to do? Return this. Let's say console.log this, so we can see what's inside. All right, so now what we're getting is we're getting the printout of myBound this. And that's because when we're executing fn2, we're executing a function that was explicitly bound already to an object. Recall that call and apply, those methods can't be implemented in JavaScript. But I wanted to go through and implement bind. So we're gonna add a new function. We're gonna add a new method to the function class that will accept an argument, and then it'll return a new function, and that new function, when called, will be using this new object that we talked about. And this is like just to kind of experience and see what it looks like inside of, or how it might be implemented inside of JavaScript, right? So let's say that we have a new, we're gonna use monkey patching. We're just gonna, it's called like reopening. We're going to open the function object and add stuff to it by saying, here we're going to say function.prototype.myBind is a new function, right? Okay, so we're adding a new function, or we're adding a new method to the function class. So now we should be able to say like function fn, and this is going to console.log, this is my this, and we'll console.log this, okay? Now, by adding this method to the prototype on the function class, when we create new functions later, like this function, when we create a new instance of it here, and then we go to, we can work with that instance of the function. So we can say fn.bind or apply or call, and then we can also access our myBind. So we can say myBind, and recall that this is possible because we're going to look up, does fn.myBind exist? No. Does fn.__proto__.myBind exist? Yes, it does now, because we just defined it, right? We just defined it here. So it will look up through the prototype for the function and find this new object or this new function or this new method on the function class called myBind, right? Now, back here, the default bind that comes with JavaScript takes an argument, and that argument is, it actually technically takes a couple of arguments. You can bind this, and then you can also bind arguments that are will be explicitly passed in. So we'll start with this. So we'll start with passing in a new object that we want to be bound explicitly when our function is ultimately called. Okay, so when we say fn.myBind, we're going to pass in some object. So const bind to this. Okay, Google, stop. And in here, I'm going to say message success. All right, so if we pass in bind to this, we expect to be able to use the result of calling myBind and store that value in a new function fn2, and then we expect to be able to call fn2, and that should log out this is my this, and it should print out message success. So if we run it right now, nothing is going to happen. This doesn't work. So it's saying fn2 is not a function. That's because our myBind implementation does not return a function yet. So we can return a function from another function. So we can say return function, and we'll start there, okay, and then we'll build up. So now we have a function that returns another function, and by default, nothing is being printed out yet, but it is executing. So now we have fn.myBind. We're calling fn.myBind here, right? So we have an instance of a function class. We're executing it, and it's returning this function. That function is being stored in fn2, then we're executing fn2, but nothing is happening because the function that we're returning from fn.myBind is doing nothing right now, okay? So instead what we want to do is we're going to return this function, but when that function is called, so when fn2 is called, we want to execute fn, and we want to execute fn call style or apply style, and we want to pass in the arguments that were passed to myBind. So we'll just start easy, and we're going to say here, when we're in the function myBind, we have reference to fn. So we want to say const fn equals this, right? So I'm going to make it a little bit more explicit. So original function is this. Now, when function is executed, we want to return the result of original function dot call and pass in this, right? Because here we're able to actually execute the original function, which again was fn. So here we're going to execute it, and because we're using the call or apply style, we're able to pass in this. So it's going to be bound to this when original function is executed. So let's run this again. This is this, and we get object. That's because it's being converted to an object. We'll just say console.log this, and then we'll just say this is my message, this.message. Okay. All right, so let's run this again. Cool. This is my message, success. So we console.logged this, which was explicitly bound to our object that we passed in. So bind to this was the object that we wanted to bind to. We got back a new function, and when we executed that function style, note, we had explicitly bound this by returning a function or currying, and then binding this directly to the original function and executing it. So now let's make this even more complex. Okay, so let's change the name of our function to sum. All right, and it's going to take in A, B, and C, and we're going to accept an argument that has an X value. So for now we'll just console.log this, and let's also console.log A, B, and C. All right, so we're going to change this up. So actually, yeah, let's. Okay, so I'm going to comment this out. comment out that code. I keep saying this or trying to refer to this without saying this. All right, so let's update our code here. So now we're going to have a function called sum, which takes in A, B, and C. And we're going to return or console.log A, B, C, and console.log this. All right, so right now, sum is not executing. If we wanted to, we could just say sum and then pass in 1, 2, 3. And again, by default, this will be bound to the global object. And above the global object somewhere here, we should see our 1, 2, and 3. So boom. Okay. So there's our output for the sum of 1, 2, 3, right? We got our ABC and we got this giant global object that we don't really care about. So if we wanted to, we can say, maybe let's just say console.log A plus B plus C. So we should get back 6, right? We got back 6 and we're still getting back this global object. Now, if we wanted to make it so that we could bind sum, let's say let's make a new function that's called add2, and that's going to equal, we'll say const add2 is equal to sum dot bind to, or some object that we want to explicitly bind to this, and then the number 2, okay? And then if we say add2, by passing a second argument to bind, this 2 will be explicitly bound to A, and in the future we will only be able to pass in B and C. So if we pass in 10 and 10, then we're going to get back 22. So it should be the function that is returned from sum.bind should be a function that accepts 2 arguments, or however many arguments. But when we pass it 2 arguments, the ultimate function add2 will be executing the original function sum, and it'll first pass in 2 as the first argument, and then the remaining arguments that were actually executed in real time when we called add2, those will be passed in as the second and third argument. So if we execute this, we see 22. Now, that's a little bit advanced, and this is where it might get a little confusing, but I wanted to extend our myBind function to work just like bind. And there's a couple of interesting things that fall out of that. So let's keep building on this so that sum, so this add2 function works with our myBind. And let's actually simplify a little bit so that it's only A plus B. And so if we execute this, we should get back 12. Right? Okay, so we got back 12. That's cool. So now we're saying we have this new function called add2. We pass in some number to it, and it adds 2 to it. Right? Actually, don't know where that's console. Oh, console.logging it. Okay, cool. All right, so let's extend our myBind function so that it accepts this and then any optional arguments, right? And in JavaScript, when you have a function, not an arrow function, but a function that's defined with the function keyword, there's another thing that's bound. In addition to this, you will also get an arguments keyword. So we can say const args is arguments. So arguments is another keyword similar to this that will be bound when the function is executed. So in this case, arguments is going to be the list of arguments that this function was called with. So if we change myBind, actually, let's just console.log args, and we'll change this to myBind. Okay. So now we see the args it's an instance of arguments. In the 0 place, we have the object that this should be, and then in the first place we see 2. So we technically want all of arguments except for the first argument. So in this case, we want arguments, and I think I might do it like this, original function, comma, and then we'll use the splat operator to get the rest. So original function should still be this. That'll still be the first argument. And actually, no, I'm sorry. We still need this. And then we want the first argument is this. Right, yeah, okay. So then we don't actually have to pass any arguments or we don't have to like accept any parameters in the function definition here. Instead, we can use the arguments keyword to bind directly to the arguments that are being passed in. And the first one will be myThis, and then the rest of the arguments should be extracted. Let's see if that works. I don't know if the arguments keyword works like that. Okay, cool. Great. So now we have args, and args looks like it is an array. And recall that we have this function here that if we wanted to, we can change this to apply, and we can bind myThis, and we can pass args. All right. So now we have, because we're switching to the apply method, we can pass what we want to bind to, and then we can pass an array that contains the list of arguments. So if we execute this here, we are getting nan as the result, and that's because as it stands, we're only passing in the args that were passed in the first function, right? So when we're executing add2, we're calling add2. That's executing this function. It's calling original function, which was sum. When it calls sum, it's binding it to myThis, which is this empty object. So let's just say like name myThis. So it's binding it to myThis. But then the only other argument that it's getting is this 2. It's not getting a b, right? So it's executing with just the array with the list 2. And so it's only passing in a, it's not passing in b. Because b, this 10, right, is an argument to this function that was returned from myBind. So if we were to take, this and say like b and say args.push b and then call it, that should work, right? And we get back 12. Cool. But we want to make it a little bit more generic so that we don't have to say like B, C, D, E, and then like push, right? We can say arguments, or I'm sorry, we can use the arguments keyword. The arguments keyword here is going to be bound when myBind is executed. And then the arguments keyword inside of this function will be bound when this function is executed. So we can say args.concat arguments. I think we might be able to just call it like this. All right, let's see what we got. 2 plus, okay, so concat did not work. I remember there being like an odd thing that you have to do in order to get the arguments. So let's say it's like array.prototype.slice arguments 0 args2, and let's see, args2, is that going to work? No. Array.slice.call. No. Yeah, call. Let's see. Slice of undefined. Okay. So the arguments keyword, like this arguments object, is an instance of arguments. It's not an instance of array, which is like a really weird thing. So it doesn't act like an array. And so in order to do array-like things on it, you have to convert it to an array. And this is one of the ways that you can convert it to an array. You call array.prototype.slice.call, and then you pass in arguments in 0 so that it's like creating a slice of the arguments object and turning it into an array. So then we get args2, which is going to be the list of arguments passed when we actually executed the returned function. So in this case, args2 is going to be just like the array with 10 in it. So if we say console.log args2, args2, then we get back args2 is the array 10. So we see args concat args2, so we're combining those two arrays, and we're using apply, so the resulting array is going to be separated out into little individual arguments, and then we'll be binding to this. So when we actually execute the mySum function, this is bound to the object that we passed in myThis, and then we have add2, which is passing in this curried, or myBind is currying this argument to, and then when we call add to, that is a function that was explicitly bound to this myThis object. This is probably like way more detail than we need to go into, but it's kind of cool to see how this is bound. And I wanted to go like pretty in depth here. So there's a couple other like odd things around what this is bound to when you're working in the browser. So from the DOM, right, from each DOM element, if you're executing functions, depending on which function it is, if it's an event listener, for instance, then this will be bound to the target element that was executing on. But I'm hopeful that this explanation was useful. Again, going back to what this is bound to, I think if you follow the pattern of 4 ways of calling a function, function style, call apply style, constructor style, and method style, then you're going to go pretty far in understanding and being able to work with this. Also, just kind of watching out for the trip hazards that are the anonymous function, and then finally knowing that you can explicitly bind this if you want to. Hopefully that was useful. I will see you in the next one.